In 1882, the U.S. Navy steamer, the USRC Thomas Corwin, positioned itself outside the village of Angoon, Alaska, loaded its guns, and launched explosive shells into the village of men, women, and children, killing 6 children and leading to the deaths of countless more because of the devastation, leaving people without food or shelter for the coming winter of 1882. Then last month, after 142 years of waiting, the U.S. Navy offered an official apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing and asked forgiveness of the Tlingit people of Angoon. Here's the story.
This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel.
Welcome back to Tell Your Story Alaska. Today is a unique episode because normally on Mondays I do a village profile. In fact, 2 village profiles. And this week I was preparing and studying for Angoon and Aniak. But as I was studying Angoon, more and more of the story of Angoon began to blossom, and I got sucked into it, and I went down all the rabbit holes, and I studied and learned and watched hours of YouTube video to get the full grasp of this story. And I'm going to do the best I can to capture it in just a short episode, the story of Angoon. And this is unique because the finality of this story happened just a month ago. A story that is 142 years old came to a beautiful resolution just 1 month ago. And so I wanted to just focus this episode just on Angoon and make this kind of a special episode, a very special village profile of Angoon, Alaska. So we'll start with the history of Angoon, Alaska. Angoon, Alaska is a Tlingit community, and it is the only permanent settlement on Admiralty Island, which is quite a large island in southeastern Alaska on the Panhandle. It is on the southwest side of the Kootsnahu Inlet, and Angoon is 60 miles southwest of Juneau. And the name Angoon means Isthmus Town. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably might have thought, what is an isthmus? And if you don't remember, like me from high school geography class, I also had to look it up. An isthmus is a narrow strip of land with sea on either side, forming a link between 2 larger areas of land. Now, if you look on Google Earth, you can see that Angoon, Alaska is indeed on an isthmus. It's a beautiful narrow strip of land. It's remote, and you could probably walk across this in just a couple of minutes. It's that narrow. But this, of course, creates a very beautiful atmosphere and a place that you may want to visit. Admiralty Island, where Angoon is located, has long been the home of the Kootsnahu Tlingit tribe. Kootsnahu means fortress of bears. Obviously, a history of bears there. Today, the island is a part of the Tongass National Forest, which is the largest national forest in the United States, covering nearly 17 million acres, and it is also the world's largest remaining temperate rainforest. Kind of unique. You don't think of Alaska when it comes to rainforests. I always think of the Amazon, but this one is the largest remaining temperate rainforest in the United States. The locals of Angoon rightly pride themselves in the preservation of the area. It is largely left totally untouched. The trees are beautiful. You can look at photos of them online. Some of them can be up to 400 years old. So if you think about that, while the pilgrims of the Mayflower were landing on the eastern shores, some of these trees were little seedlings. Angoon is accessible only by seaplane or a 6.5-hour ferry ride from Juneau, and those who visit leave with a desire to return. There's a handful of YouTube videos that I watched about people visiting there. A post office was established in Angoon in 1923, which is kind of like when it becomes an official town. Two notable churches in Angoon's history was a Russian Orthodox church building built in 1928 and a Presbyterian church built by a native pastor named Samuel Johnson in 1925. Now, to give context to our Angoon story, we can provide a little bit of context from a series of papers I found called the Killisnoo Papers. These are a series of handwritten letters dating from 1878 to 1911. You can find this collection on the University of Alaska Fairbanks archive. Now, the earliest letter in these letters was written by a missionary named John G. Brady, dated March 30th, 1878, from Fort Wrangell, Alaska, and it provides some insight into the culture of Angoon at the time. Now, this is a time when missionaries were moving into the area, and there was a cultural shift towards Christianity during this time. And so it's an interesting cultural shift. And here is what the letter says from this missionary to give an idea of what was happening in Angoon in 1878, just a few years prior to the event we're going to talk about. The letter says, "To all whom it may concern, Ka Yaukti, a chief of the Kutsnanu tribe, called to see me this afternoon. He says he wants his people to have schools and churches, and that heretofore have been bad and foolish, but now they want to do better. He intends to be a firm friend to the white man, and will do all in his power to prevent his people from doing anyone harm. He heard of my being here and came to see me to tell me what he wanted. His tribe has had a bad name, but may the time be hastened when they shall have the love of God in their hearts and guide them in paths of righteousness. I beg of all men to treat him kindly and encourage him to thirst after better things. May the salvation, life, and teachings of the Lord Jesus Christ be made known to his people. John G. Brady." And so this coming from the missionary recounting when he spoke to the chief of the tribe of Angoon about their desire to hear more of the gospel and have good relations with the white man. And so we see in an ever-changing world at the time, here is a chief showing incredible amounts of humility. And so we see some of the character of the people of Angoon desiring peace with these outsiders that are quickly rushing in, which shows the tenacity and the strength of this tribe to be open to that. They come with open minds and open hearts to the newcomers. Now, from the 1700s to the mid-1800s, fur trade was the major money-making activity in the area. Alaska used to be owned by the Russians, and the first thing that drew them there was the fur trade, and this was dominant from the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s. Now, in 1878, an American company called the Northwest Trading Company, established a trading post and a whaling station nearby Killisnoo Island. Now, Killisnoo Island is just south of where modern-day Angoon is now. The employment opportunity, a school, and a Russian Orthodox church on this trading post attracted many Tlingits to Killisnoo, and the company hired local Tlingits from Angoon as deckhands on these whaling ships. And certainly, having Tlingit deckhands for their whaling ships made their knowledge and skill in whaling incredibly valuable to the Northwest Trading Company. Then in 1882 is when our real story starts. A whaling vessel's harpoon charge accidentally misfired and exploded on one of the ships. The explosion killed a Tlingit shaman and injured several others. The shaman's name was Tilchlin, which means big dog salmon. And as a shaman, he was considered a very important person to the village, and he was considered just as the same as importance as a village chief. And therefore, at the death of their shaman, the people of Angoon went into a 4-day period of mourning. And in these times of mourning, they say that they do nothing but mourn. Now, as a part of their normal cultural way of doing things, the villagers demanded a payment of 200 blankets for the death of their shaman from the Northwest Trading Company. This was a customary means of handling these types of situations among the Tlingit people. However, the Northwest Trading Company felt threatened, and the superintendent of the company, a man named Vanderbilt, who was based out of Killisnoo Island, he took a boat from Killisnoo with his family to Sitka, where the U.S. Navy was based. Vanderbilt reported to the Navy that the people of Angoon were making threats. Now, it's unclear why the superintendent believed there was a threat, since there's no evidence that the people of Angoon were making any threats outside of their very reasonable demand for 200 blankets. Now, some versions claim that the Tlingits kidnapped 2 white people from the whaling ship, and other versions of the story deny this. One of the factors in this case is the possibility of miscommunication. It is said that the Tlingit people had limited English capability, not for any academic reasons, only that it's just not their language. And so there's a possibility of miscommunication just because of language and cultural barriers. Now, myself, as one who has learned to speak a couple other languages, I can testify that it's very difficult to cross language and cultural barriers. However, it does seem like the Tlingit people did have a little bit of English, enough to commence their trades that they had. Now, the demand for 200 blankets may have been interpreted as a threat, but it was a normal custom for the Tlingit people to demand blankets for deaths such as this. The previous commander of the U.S. Navy in this area was Commander Beardsley, and Beardsley apparently understood this custom of the exchange of blankets when deaths like this happen. However, Merriman was a brand new commander at the time, and also Commander Healy, and they appeared to be ignorant of these customs. Other claims state that there is no justification for the interpretation of threat by the superintendent, and it was simply prejudice is the implication. So whatever the case, Superintendent Vanderbilt felt threatened, and he reported to the U.S. Navy in Sitka of an impending conflict, that threats were being made by the people of Angoon. Now available to the U.S. Navy was the USS Adams under the command of Commander Healy and Commander Edgar C. Merriman. However, the USS Adams was deemed too big to navigate the waters near Angoon, and so the USRC Thomas Corwin, a small Navy steamer ship, was commissioned for the task under Captain Merriman. Now, the Thomas Corwin had an impressive life exploring the waters around Alaska, including a handful of rescues off remote islands, and even hosting the famous outdoorsman and writer John Muir on his trip to Alaska. But on this day in October 1882, when Superintendent Vanderbilt made his report, the USRC Thomas Corwin, under Captain Edgar C. Merriman, was ready to respond. Now, it's important to keep in mind that at this time, Alaska was a U.S. territory. Alaska was purchased in 1867 from the Russians, and it was under U.S. military control. So there wasn't like a state government like we're used to in the States now. At the time, Alaska was only considered a territory, and it was controlled by the U.S. Navy rather than a state government. And so the U.S. Navy was basically in charge, and it was up to them to handle conflicts like this. So when the USRC Thomas Corwin steamed up to the village of Angoon in 1882, Captain Merriman quickly took 9 hostages and demanded 400 blankets to be delivered the next day, or he would shell the village and the summer camp nearby. So here we have an unnecessary escalation of events, but in response, the people of Angoon collected 81 blankets and delivered them to Captain Merriman. And Captain Merriman was apparently very unsatisfied with this and saw this as a position of aggression, which is a very strange conclusion to make, but apparently that's what he felt. So Captain Merriman steamed the Thomas Corwin steamship up into position just outside the lagoon near Angoon. He loaded his guns and he began to shell the village on October 26, 1882. At the time, there was a young man named Billy Jones, who was 13 years old at the time of the bombardment. Fortunately, Billy Jones survived the bombardment, and later in 1950, he recalled his experience, and in a series of letters and interviews, and at this time in 1950, Billy was 81 years old, and he recalled this event, saying, "He stood on a hill, holding his mom, watching the shelling down below. Why are they doing this?" he asked his mom, but she didn't have an answer because she didn't know. According to Billy Jones, the villagers did not have any warning of the coming American ship, and they had no idea that there was even a possible coming conflict. They did not anticipate this. They didn't perceive that they were threatening in any way. And so it seemed completely unprovoked. Now, when the smoke cleared from the shelling, 6 Tlingit children were killed by smoke inhalation. In another report, it said there were 7, but most reports say 6. But the devastation did not even stop there. After the shelling ended, the Navy came to shore. The Navy militiamen came to shore with rifles, chopping up 40 canoes that were parked on the shore. They destroyed the village's food supplies, which they had been collecting all summer, and they burned the homes with fuel. Now, some of the reports say all of the homes were destroyed. That's what the Tlingit version of the story says, that they were all destroyed. The Navy's version of the story says almost all were destroyed. Regardless, the Tlingit women and children fled the area when the shelling started, only to return to find that their homes and all their food supply and their canoes were totally decimated. On another a retelling of this story, it said that men who were out fishing and hunting returned to find their homes totally destroyed, and they did not understand why. Now, Merriman's 9 hostages were put onto another boat called the Favorite. There was 2 boats there, the one called the Favorite and the other called the Thomas Corwin. On the 2 boats, he brought his 9 hostages back to Sitka and were held as prisoners there. Now, this having taken place in late October of 1882, winter was just around the corner, and the people of Angoon has just lost everything. They lost their homes, they lost their entire supply. And if you live in Alaska, you know, and I have a freezer full of moose meat right now that I got in the warmer months, and now it's in my freezer to prepare for the winter. Obviously, it's not as critical for my survival, but for them, this was absolutely critical, and they lost all of it. So as winter rolled in, they proceeded to slowly freeze and starve to death, perhaps facing a worse fate than the children who had died of the smoke inhalation. And we do not know how many people died that winter. It's just an unknown number of people died as a result of this event. Now, interestingly, the Thomas Corwin kept a ship's log. And we have those logs, and I'm going to read them to you because they're interesting. On the day of the event of October 26, 1882, the log reads this: a record of miscellaneous events of the day. And then it offers a handful of casual weather reports and depth measurements. And then it says, quote, made preparations for shelling Indian village, unquote. Then more weather reports. Then, quote, Indians bringing but 81 blankets, burned their summer houses and destroyed 40 canoes. At 1:15 got underway and stood out of lagoon, followed by other vessels. At 2 p.m., off to Huchu, which is Angoon. Village and I shelled it. Land, marine, and sailors from Corwin and Favorite under the cover of guns and fired village. No resistance from the Indians. Unquote. Now, it's interesting, these logs, because they seem to be casually commenting on the fact that they're shelling innocent people in between comments about the weather. And so the casual tone of these logs just kind of make it seem like the Navy officers didn't really think much about what they were doing. which just kind of adds to the hideousness of this event. The apathy, the moral apathy that they were feeling does seem to come out in these logbooks. It's almost eerie to read it, Captain Merriman later, facing criticism for his actions, he put a lot of effort into justifying his actions, making his arguments. Fortunately, it appears that most people did not buy Merriman's justifications. For example, Frank Clark, who was commander over Captain Merriman at the time, said, quote, "Most of the officers, including myself, considered a brutal and cowardly thing and entirely uncalled for. We are all anxious to see the account of the papers and will give of we are all anxious to see the account of the papers will give of and the report the captain will give of it. In other words, how big a lie he will tell to justify himself," unquote. So it's clear that Captain Merriman was, not everyone was buying his justification, so that's a good thing. Now, one silver lining in this story is that there was a single canoe that survived the attack. They destroyed 40, but one of them survived. This is called the Beaver Canoe, and it's called that because of a beaver that, a wood carving beaver that was on the bow of the ship. Now, this singular canoe served the people of Angoon that winter, which they used for hunting, fishing, and gathering supplies, which of course did not stave off the starvation and freezing, but it was their singular canoe that served them at that time. Years later, the aging canoe became unusable and it was ceremonially cremated. And cremation is a way to give it honor for its service to the village. Now, the beaver carving that was from the bow of the ship was kept. They didn't cremate that as a remembrance of it. However, the beaver was lost around 1911, and nobody knows what happened to it. Although incredibly, in 2011, the beaver was found, and this is exactly 100 years later after it was lost, and it was found at the American Museum of Natural History in the Upper West Side of New York City. Now, how the beaver ended up at the museum in New York, nobody really knows how that happened, but the beaver, however, was returned for this ceremony that I'll describe shortly in 2024. And so the beaver is now back where it belongs in Angoon, Alaska. A great memorial to this event also. Now, after this event, only 2 years later, it prompted the 1884 First Organic Act, which moved control of Alaska from the military to civilian control. During the debate leading up to this act, Representative James Budd of California said of Captain Merriman, quote, "The Indians did not comply with this peremptory order of this royal dictator." So he's obviously being sarcastic here. He said, "I understand they did not have enough blankets. The commander of this United States vessel was a law unto himself. And in the morning, he, a United States officer, judge, jury, and sheriff, fulfilled his threat and shelled the Indian village," unquote. So although this was not an apology, it was kind of a half-measured acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But it wasn't until 1973, this is about 90 years later, the Indians Claims Commission awarded the Angoon village $90,000 in compensation. However, the compensation was limited to only physical damage, and it did not account for inflation or interest. So again, this was not an official apology, but it does acknowledge that something wrong had happened way back in 1882. Now, attempts by the Tlingit people over these last 140 years to prompt the Navy to apologize were made, but to no avail. One of the Tlingit men commenting on this, a lecture that I watched, he felt that if the Navy started to apologize to small communities, that they would not be able to do anything else. I'm not sure exactly what he meant by that, except that clearly he felt that the Navy didn't want to apologize for perhaps their own pride or some other strategic means. But there has been at least half acknowledgments of wrongdoing at the time. And that was in 1973 where this compensation was made, but still without an official apology, the Tlingit people were not happy with it, and rightfully so. Then in 1982, on the 100-year anniversary, the village of Angoon invited the locals in Angoon to record their testimonies about this event that happened 100 years prior. The older residents expressed how much hurt that they still felt because of this thing that happened 100 years prior. The Tlingit people have a strong sense of justice, clearly, for the events that happened a century ago, and the memory of these horrific injustices clearly do not fade with time in the heart of the Tlingit people. Then, finally, with a few more promptings from the Tlingit people to the U.S. Navy, this would have been last May in 2024, the U.S. Navy said that they would offer a formal apology, and they decided to do it on the 142nd anniversary of the bombardment on October 26, 2024, just about a month ago from when I recorded this. U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Mark Succato gave the official apology on behalf of the U.S. Navy to the Tlingit people of Angoon. Now, this is a really neat event that took place in a large gymnasium. You can watch it on YouTube. I'll put a link in the notes. It's like an 11-hour-long event. So there's a lot to sift through, but there's quite a celebration here. But in the apology, Admiral Succato went up to the mic, and I'm only going to quote a part of what he said, but he said, quote, "I'm here today representing the Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable Carlos del Toro, to formally apologize to the affected Alaskan Native clans for the wrongful military actions taken against the Tlingit village of Angoon today, October 26, 1882. The Navy recognized the pain and suffering inflicted upon the Tlingit people, and we acknowledge the wrongful actions resulting in the loss of life, the loss of recourse, the loss of culture, and created and afflicted intergenerational trauma on these clans. The Navy takes the significance of this action very seriously and knows an apology is long overdue. If the Secretary of the Navy were here today, though, he would say it is never too late to do the right thing." And Admiral Succato goes on to describe the events in detail as the Navy saw it in their records, and acknowledging of its wrongdoing. Now, in the same ceremony, one of the elders came up to the mic, and he said of this apology, quote, "We've reached the point that many of our grandparents have only dreamed of. To have heard the words you uttered here today, Admiral, was something so many of them yearned to hear. This apology puts our people on the road to being able to heal from the generational pain of the generational trauma that our people have suffered since the shelling. You have opened a door for us to do exactly that, Admiral Succato, you and the entire U.S. Navy. None of us in this room will ever forget, ever. We will take it to our graves, we will teach it to our children, and we will do all that we can that the children who aren't even born yet will learn of this day. Your names will be taught to them. Your presence here today will be taught to them," unquote. And now the speech goes on like this for quite a while. I encourage you, if you're interested, to go click on the link below and you can watch the rest of the speeches. And it wasn't just one speech, there were many, many speeches. Later in the ceremony, an elder, and actually several elders, get up and said basically all the same thing. Quote, they said, "I am very happy to say we accept your apology," unquote. And so the Healing of Angoon has begun with the reconciliation between the Tlingit people and the U.S. Navy. The rest of the ceremony that took place just a month ago was made up of many speeches, dances, storytelling, and there was food and songs sung by the Tlingit people in their traditional dresses, and it had the vibe of celebration. A burden has been lifted as forgiveness settles in the hearts of the people. This bitterness that has lingered for so long has come to rest. So what can we learn from this story? These are my own personal thoughts. If you don't want to hear my thoughts, you can stop the episode now. But here are my thoughts. It is forgiveness not revenge, not remaining in bitterness, not holding on to anger, but the radical notion of forgiveness towards one not deserving it. This is how cultures heal. According to Scripture, the world has been broken by sin. I do not know what was going on in the heart of Superintendent Vanderbilt, that he would interpret the request for 200 blankets as a threat. Or I don't know what was going on in the crazed mind of Captain Merriman to fire upon an innocent village for unfounded reasons. But it is clear that the ripple effect of sin over generations led up to this point, and afterwards the damage caused by this in the following generations caused incredible pain. And it took forgiveness, not justice, to bring an end to this trauma and to begin renewal. It is clear that whether you are white or native, all of us need this kind of grace. It is only something we can receive as a gift. We do not deserve it, but all of us need it. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast." So to find an example of how cultures heal from past injustices and wounds, you need to look no further than the strength of the Tlingit people of Angoon, Alaska.